Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the prophecy of Hosea and chapter 5, the Old Testament prophecy of Hosea and chapter 5. One feature of our modern legal system is the way in which cases appear to be dragged out over weeks and months. For example, if someone is charged for a crime today, the court case will begin in about 6 months' time, and then having finally begun, it can often be adjourned for all sorts of reasons, having eventually recommenced. All the evidence and the arguments from both sides are heard, and then there is another pause in the proceedings. And that is the pause as the jury retire to consider the evidence and to decide on a verdict. And if you are the person in the dock, then it is perhaps that pause, the pause for the jury to reach a verdict, it's perhaps that pause that is the most difficult one. You have heard all the evidence against you, and now you can do nothing but simply wait until the verdict is announced. What an agonizing wait that must be. And that is the wait between chapters 4 and 5 of Hosea. If you were with us a few weeks ago, then you may remember that chapter 4 began with the Lord. It's a courtroom scenario. The Lord bringing a charge against the inhabitants of the northern kingdom. Chapter 4, verse 1, hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. And that charge was, there is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. And the remainder of chapter 4 explained how that absence of core covenant characteristics was demonstrated in both the religious leadership of Israel and in the religious worship of Israel. And now that we have reached chapter 5, we hear the case against Israel being brought to a close with a verdict and a sentence being announced. And that brings me to my first point this evening, and that is in verses 1 to 7. And there we see the futility of a merely external religion. The futility of a merely external religion. Now, from what we are told in verse 1, it appears that the Lord is now addressing everyone within the northern kingdom. Hear this, you priests. Pay attention, you Israelites. Listen, O royal house. It's from the top to the very bottom of Israelite society. This judgment is against you. And here is why a judgment is being pronounced. You have become a snare at Mizpah, a net spread out on Tabor. Now, Mizpah and Tabor were places which were famous in the history of God's people. They were places where Israel had demonstrated her unique relationship to God and her unique God-given role in the world. But now, they were places of idol worship. And as such, they were a trap to people. That is the significance of the snare and the net in verse 1. The very places that have featured so prominently in Israel's history, those very places are now a snare and a trap to people. And so rather than being a blessing to others, Israel was now luring people and enticing people into idolatry and violence, verse 2, into prostitution and corruption, verse 3, and the solemn warning in verse 3 is that God knows all about it. There is nothing that they can hide from an all-seeing God. But however bad that summary of Israel's moral and spiritual state was, the really frightening thing was verse 4, their deeds do not permit them to return to their God. Isn't that scary? Their deeds do not permit them to return to their God. And so in addition to being a trap for others, their idolatry has become a trap for themselves, enslaving them and preventing them from returning to the Lord. And if you want to know how that has come about, then just read the second half of verse 4, which in the ESV begins with the word for, and therefore provides the explanation for the first half of the verse when it says, their deeds do not permit them to return to their God, for a spirit of prostitution is in their hearts. They do not know the Lord. As we discovered in the opening verses of chapter 4, their sinful, idolatrous behaviour was symptomatic of a much bigger and a much deeper problem, and that was the problem of a sinful, idolatrous heart. A heart that was driven by a spirit of spiritual adultery. A heart that went flirting here, there and everywhere with gods of all description under the sun, but did not know the true God, did not know the Lord. And yet, the strange thing is that Israel continued to be a very religious society. They did not know the Lord, but they continued to be very religious. Religious observance within Israel carried on pretty much as normal, as verse 6 indicates. They were still bringing their flocks and their herds as sacrifices in an attempt to seek the Lord. And yet, as verse 6 indicates, when they do so, they will not find him. And why? Because he has withdrawn himself from them. And why has God done that? Because, verse 7, they are unfaithful to the Lord. They give birth to illegitimate children, both literally and metaphorically. And so in spite of their religious observance, you can picture the sacrifices. They're bringing their flocks and their herds. And so in spite of their religious observance, they would not find the Lord, for the simple reason that their religious observance was a merely outward thing. It was going through the motions of religious routine and ritual. And yet all the time it was doing nothing, and they were doing nothing to address the inner deep-rooted problem of an idolatrous, unfaithful heart. That was the futility of a merely external religion. And sadly, that generation was not the last to experience it. You read the other Old Testament prophets, and you will see that this has been a recurrent theme, a recurrent problem in the history of God's professing people. The people turn away from the Lord. The people become unfaithful to the Lord in their hearts, but outward religious observance carries on as normal. Read chapter 1 of Isaiah, and you'll see that. And you'll hear the Lord going as far as to say in chapter 1 of Isaiah, stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. Your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. That is the futility of merely external religion. And sadly, it continues to be a frightening reality today. We look around the Welsh countryside, and we bemoan the fact that chapel after chapel has closed. There are, of course, exceptions to every rule, but is not the decline in external chapel attendance, is that not often symptomatic of an internal spiritual decline that has happened months, if not years previously? And I suggest there is, and the reason I do so is because we all know from personal experience, if we're being honest, we all know from personal experience that if or when we wander away from the Lord, the last thing that is often affected is our church attendance. That's the last thing. We wouldn't dream of missing the Sunday services because of what other people might think of us. And yet at the same time as we're appearing to be faithful in that outward, external religious observance, our hearts can be a million miles away from the Lord, devoted to all sorts of things and people other than Him. Oh yes, it's possible, just as it was in Hosea's day. It's possible to be outwardly faithful to our church or our chapel, whilst all the time being inwardly unfaithful to the Lord, as demonstrated by the inhabitants of the northern kingdom. And the verdict pronounced here in chapter 5 ought to remind us that as long as we persist in our internal infidelity to the Lord, no amount of merely outward external religious observance will result in us finding Him, to use the language of verse 6. Well, that's not because our God is playing hard to get. It's because our God is looking for more than mere external religion. He's looking for more. He's looking beneath the religious and respectable veneer of our lives, and He's looking for an internal love of Him, and He's looking for an internal faithfulness to Him. He's looking for a change of heart, a radical and a repentant change of heart, a change of heart from an idolatrous heart to a faithful heart. That is what the book of Hosea is all about. He's looking for a heart that is no longer characterized by the spiritual adultery that characterized theirs back then. Because as long as it is like theirs back then, no amount of external religion will serve as a substitute for a faithful heart. That is the futility of merely external religion. Now, please note, that is not to say that there is anything wrong with religious observances such as church attendance. I would be the last person to say that, especially on a Sunday evening, and it's great to see you all. In fact, it is often through our exposure to the warning of God's word and to the challenge of God's people at church, it is often in that way that we are made aware of how idolatrous our hearts have become. And therefore it is often through such means that we are subsequently brought back to the Lord. But the difference then is that church attendance has been a means of grace to us in that it has led to a change of heart. It has been a means to a gracious and glorious end, and not seen merely as an end in itself. But when such religious observances are viewed as being ends in themselves, religious boxes which have to be ticked to maintain our respectability, but all the time persisting in our unfaithfulness to the Lord, it is then that we are in danger of going through the routines and the rituals of religious observance It is then that we need to learn the lesson of Hosea chapter 5 and be aware of the futility of merely external religion. The second thing we have in the chapter is in verses 8 to 14. And there we see the warning of God's righteous judgment. The warning of God's righteous judgment. Now, following the jury reaching a verdict, there is often a further pause, yet another one, in our modern judicial process, and that is the pause between verdict and sentence. And so how many times have we heard in the news of someone being found guilty of murder in the Old Bailey today, but that they won't be sentenced for several weeks or several months? Well, unlike those cases, we are not going to wait several months in order to hear the sentence of Hosea chapter 5, because that's what we've got described in the verses immediately following, and it begins with a warning of coming judgment. Sound the trumpet in Gibeah, the horn in Ramah, raise the battle cry in Bethaven, lead on, O Benjamin. Now, whereas in chapter 4, verse 15, we heard of two places just north of the Israelite-Judah border, here in chapter 5, verse 9, we're hearing of two places just south of the Israelite-Judah border. Both Gibeah and Ramah were situated just inside the southern kingdom of Judah. And why, you may be thinking to yourself, why would the warning of God's judgment upon the northern kingdom be announced in southern kingdom territory? That doesn't make sense, does it? What would be the reason for that? Well, there were probably two reasons. Firstly, the judgment of God upon the northern kingdom of Israel, as described in verse 9, would come eventually in the form of an invasion from the Assyrian superpower situated to the north of Israel. And the fact that two places just south of the border are being warned of that was an indication of just how far south within the northern kingdom the Assyrians would penetrate. Don't forget, they're coming in from the north. If Gibeah and Ramah are told to be on the alert, then it suggests that the entire northern kingdom will suffer the judgment of God on that future day, when, as we are told in verse 9, Ephraim will be laid waste on the day of reckoning. But secondly, there's perhaps a second reason, and perhaps more important to the immediate context, and that is these towns within Judah are being told about the coming judgment on Israel, so that Judah herself sits up and heeds the warning. I say that because although the focus of Hosea's ministry has been on the northern kingdom, he has also highlighted on several occasions that there's problems within the southern kingdom as well. For example, as recent as verse 5, we hear that Judah also stumbles with them. She's not exempt from the problems. And throughout the remainder of this chapter, there are references to both Israel and Judah, because as we are told in verse 10, Judah's leaders are like those who move boundary stones. Now, boundary stones were before the days of privet hedges and barbed wire fences. That was how you marked out your border between you and your neighbour, between your ground and his ground, between your property and his property. And so you can imagine waking up one morning and looking out the kitchen and thinking, has that stone moved a little bit during the night, or has it been my imagination? And by moving boundary stones when no one was watching, that's how people acquired more and more property. In other words, they are renowned in Judah for their stealing of property. If Israel to the north was a den of iniquity, then you could say that Judah to the south was a den of thieves. And consequently, we hear God saying of them in verse 10, I will pour out my wrath on them like a flood of water. And so both Israel to the north and Judah to the south need to sit up and take these warnings of judgment seriously. But what is interesting is the contrasting description of God's judgment that is presented in the remainder of this chapter. Did you notice that contrast? In verses 12 and 14. Whereas in verse 14, the warning seems to be of a coming judgment in the future. In verse 12, it seems to be speaking of a present judgment. And whereas the picture of judgment in verse 14 is loud and obvious, I will be like a lion to Ephraim, like a great lion to Judah. The picture in verse 12 is of a judgment which is more subtle and silent. I am like a moth to Ephraim, like dry rot to the people of Judah. Now, it's not a bigger problem as it used to be, and those of you who are younger tonight might be thinking, what on earth is he talking about here? And it's not as big a problem as it was in the past, but some of us have had the awful experience of bringing clothes out of the wardrobe in spring, only to discover that they've got holes in them. And you think, how on earth did that happen? I didn't think I wore that jacket that much last year, and so it should still be in good top quality condition, but I've brought it out of the wardrobe, I've only worn it and it's got holes in it. How has it happened? It happened because throughout the winter months, when you thought nothing was happening, there has been something secretly and silently working away within your wardrobe, i.e. a moth. And in doing so, it has destroyed your favourite clothes. And even if moths aren't as big a problem as they once were, I know what still is a massive problem, and that is dry rot in our buildings. Owners of properties throughout the city, and the number of people you meet who have been faced with this issue, owners of property throughout this city have known what it is to discover that rainwater has been getting in over a long period of time, and unknown to them, completely unknown to them, it has set in motion a process of rot which silently and secretly, undercover, under the plaster, it just works its way, destroying the fabric of the building, and it works its way along walls, and it works its way from room to room. And if you live in a terraced house, here is the frightening thing: it can work its way from house to house, from house to house, resulting in enormous damage to several houses in a street, completely unseen, silently and secretly working away. Do you see the similarity between the moth and the dry rot? Both get to work secretly and silently behind the scenes, and yet their work is nevertheless damaging and destructive. And here is the scary thing. God is using those as an illustration of his chastening and his judging work upon both the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Did you notice? They thought they were having a whale of their time. They thought they were having a whale of their time in their social and moral and religious depravity, especially as they assumed that their perpetuation of the sacrificial system provided them with all the religious security that they needed, and so they can carry on doing what they're doing, having a great time, living like this Monday to Saturday, and doing a little bit with a sacrifice on a Sunday. Wow, we've got the best of both worlds. Isn't it wonderful? When in reality, the truth was that God was already exercising his righteous judgment. He was judging them Not in big, obvious ways, such as an invasion or an earthquake or a pandemic, but by secretly and silently withdrawing his presence, secretly and silently withdrawing his restraining hand and allowing them to carry on in their sin, allowing them to be content with their lifestyle, allowing them to feel secure in their completely unfounded security. That was God's judgment. Isn't that a frightening form of judgment? It is. And what Paul tells us in Romans chapter 1 is that that is how God still works in judgment today. In his wrath, in his anger, in his judgment, he just quietly and silently removes his restraining hand and gives people over to do what they want to do, gives people over to unrestrained affection for sin. And you look, if you read Romans chapter 1, you'll see the similarities. You look at the moral and the social mess of our society tonight, and you think to yourself, oh boy, we look like a society that is ripe for judgment at some point in the future. Have you ever said that? Have you ever thought like that? You look out on our Western societies and you think, oh no, we are a society that is ripe for judgment at some point in the future. And in reply, Paul would say, don't be so naive. Don't be so naive. What you see around you is evidence that the judgment of God is already taking place. It's already in motion. Like the moth and the dry rot, secretly and silently at work, simply giving people over to their sinful and selfish desires, but nevertheless with disastrous and destructive consequences. That is Paul's description of God's secret and silent judgment out there in a pagan, godless world. Paul is not talking in Romans 1 about an expression of God's wrath in the future. He's talking about the present expression of God's wrath. Romans 1:18, the wrath of God is being revealed. That is Paul's description of God's present and secret and silent judgment out there in a pagan, godless world. But what Hosea chapter 5 tells us is that that is also how God can sometimes be at work in judgment amongst those who profess to be his people. Amongst those who participate in external religious observance, but whose hearts are far away from him. For example, it may be that our hearts are far away from him, but we think that it's great. We think that it's great that we can give our love and our loyalty and our allegiance to 1,001 other gods during the week, but still feel both comfortable and comforted by worshipping the real God on a Sunday. Beware, says the prophet Hosea. The fact that we are content and the fact that we are comforted by the merely outward religious observance on a Sunday when there is not a hint of love for God or a scratch of faithfulness to God during the week, that may be something to worry about rather than something to be happy about. The fact that we are comfortable and content in continuing in our idolatry, and the fact that we are comforted in our spiritual adultery, may very well be a telltale sign that the moth and the dry rot of God's judgment is already at work. And if that is the case, then now is the time to do something about it, before God's judgment is expressed more loudly and more clearly, and perhaps even more finally, as described in verse 14. That is the warning of God's righteous judgment. Thirdly and finally, we see the failure of a false remedy. The failure of a false remedy, verses 13 and 15. Now, it may be that the illustration of God operating as a moth or as dry rot, or worse still as a great lion, is not something that you would have thought of, at least not when describing God's work amongst his professing people. You might have thought that that's how you describe God's judgment at work in the godless world, but you perhaps wouldn't have ever thought of describing his work amongst his professing people in that way. And yet that is precisely what we have here. But what we also have to remember is that such aspects of his work amongst his people was and is always carried out with a chastening and therefore a restoring purpose in view. And that is why, having heard about the various forms that God's judgment upon the northern kingdom would take, we read these words in verse 15. Then I will go back to my place until they admit their guilt, and they will seek my face. In their misery, they will earnestly seek me. Rather than looking for mere outward religious observance on the part of these people, please note, God is looking for a true and sincere acknowledgement of their guilt. He is looking for a true repentance from sin and a true returning to him as their God. That is God's ultimate purpose and desire in his dealings with these people. And the big question is, will it actually happen? Will it come to pass? Well, to find the answer to that question, you'll need to keep coming to the remainder of the series and the remainder of the book. But what we can say at this point in the book is that it's not looking likely. The prospects are not very good. And why do I say that? Well, if you look at verse 13, you will see that following the devastation caused by the moth and the dry rot of God's judgment, both Ephraim, i.e. the northern kingdom, and Judah, i.e. the southern kingdom, they both realized to some extent that they were in a poor state. But what did they do about it? When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his sores, then Ephraim turned to Assyria and sent to the great king for help. And on hearing that, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that wasn't such a bad idea after all, was it? After all, Assyria was the great superpower of the day, and so surely if anyone could help them in their distress, surely it would be Assyria with all her power and her wealth and her international clout, was it not? Well, let's read on and find out, second half of verse 13. Ephraim sent to the great king for help, but he's not able to cure you. Not able to heal your sores. You see, their sores were not merely the consequence of their economic struggles. Their sores were not merely the consequence of their military inferiority. Instead, their sores were the consequence of their spiritual condition. Having turned away from the Lord, they were being chastised by the Lord. And therefore, as verse 15 indicates, The solution, and the only solution, is to acknowledge their guilt and return to the Lord. But rather than turning to the Lord, as they ought to have done, the Northern Kingdom turns to the great superpower of the day, and needless to say, they can do nothing to help them. And their example provides us with a warning of a false remedy and a misplaced trust. It's a warning because the temptation to do a similar thing still exists today. Don't you find that? It may be that there have been times in our experience when we have examined our lives and we have found that, like the inhabitants of the Northern Kingdom, we have found that there are other things and other people taking the place of God within our lives. Rather than giving the true and the living God the love and the loyalty and the allegiance that he deserves, we have given it to 1,000,001 other things instead. And on realizing that, what do we do? Well, the temptation is exactly the same today as it was for those people back then. Rather than acknowledging our guilt before the Lord, rather than repenting of our idolatry and turning to the Lord as we ought to, and we look here, there, and everywhere for alternative solutions to our moral and our spiritual dilemma. We look to all sorts of other things in life: friends, family, economic success, prosperity, comfortable lifestyle, all sorts of other things. We look to all sorts of other things to make up for the great loss of being unfaithful to the Lord. And it may be that we try and compensate for it by doing all sorts of other things, some of them that may even be good in and of themselves. We become more charitable, we become more religious, we become more respectable. When all the time, what is really required of us is, as verse 15 says, to acknowledge our guilt, return to the Lord. Because it doesn't work. That is the failure of a false remedy, as these people discovered in the 8th century BC. And so rather than perpetually making their mistake, and that's why the experience of God's professing people throughout history is recorded in Scripture. That's why so much of Old Testament is about what God's people have done in the past. It's so, says Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, that we might not make the mistakes they made. And so rather than perpetuating their mistake, let us make use of the remedy, the only remedy, that the eternal God has provided for idolatrous, adulterous sinners like you and me. Let us do as verse 15 says. Let us admit our guilt and seek his face. Let us do as those people in Thessalonica did that we heard about this morning. Let us turn to God from idols. You see, the problem with the people in Hosea's day, they were turning to God with their sacrifices, or so they thought, but they had never turned from their idols. And God says, that's not on. And so let us be like the Thessalonians. Let us turn to God from our idols to serve the living and the true God, as those people did in the 1st century. Let us turn in repentance from those things that have cluttered up our hearts and our minds and our lives and our affections. Let us turn from them. And let us turn in faith to that sacrifice for sin that God has provided for sinners like you and me in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ. No matter, you say, I did that 14 years ago, I did that 7 years ago, I did that 7 months ago. No matter how many times we may have done that before, that continues to be the only remedy for wayward, wandering, idolatrous, adulterous people like you and me. Repentance and faith. Turning from our idols, turning to God, trusting in the provision that he has made for us in the person of Jesus Christ. That is the only remedy for idolatrous, adulterous people like you and me. Anything else will prove to be a false remedy, because there is nothing else and no one else who can ultimately rescue us from the righteous judgment of God, as those people back then discovered to their cost. 3 lessons from Hosea chapter 2. Firstly, the futility of a merely external religion. Secondly, the warning of God's righteous judgment. And thirdly, the failure of a false remedy.